Hello and welcome to this Portfolio Institutional podcast on ESG in fixed income. We would like to thank our sponsors, Aon and Newton Investment Management, for their continued support. Now, a good place to start would be to let our panel introduce themselves. Welcome to this roundtable discussion this morning, which we're focusing on ESG in fixed income. I'm Mark Dunn, the editor of Portfolio Institutional, and I will be your host for the next hour. So these things don't usually last any longer than that. Just some housekeeping first. I'm recording this, and an edited transcript will be appearing in a standalone supplement, which will be published with our February edition. So expect that to hit your desks in the first week of that month. And also Brendan, you've met, of course. Can't forget him, once you've met him. He's going to stay around. He's going to be snapping away while we're talking. And of course, we already got the microphones here. So this is also being recorded for a podcast. So there you go. Some of you may have worked together before. You may have already introduced yourself. I think it's a good place to start and make sure you actually know exactly who we're talking to.
My name is Alan Pickering. I'm a full-time trustee of defined benefit and defined contribution schemes, and I guess my starting point when I'm looking after other people's money is that if it's legal, it's investable.
Yeah, my name is Scott Friedman. I'm a portfolio manager and analyst at Newton Investment Management. Part of my role, and quite a lot increasingly so, is focused on how we integrate ESG into fixed income, and we've launched some specific sustainable bond funds off the back of that as well.
Good morning, my name is Jennifer O'Neill. I'm a senior specialist in Aon's responsible investment practice in the UK. My role largely involves trustee education, so helping them to navigate the landscape that is ESG. I guess communicating the concept that ESG is not just relevant to equity portfolios, so today is highly relevant.
Good morning all. My name is Tom and I'm from Mercer, responsible investment team there, and my focus is pretty similar to yours, Jennifer. Again, trustee education, and I also do quite a lot of work with climate change and understanding what's important, whether it is in fixed income or equities, the scenarios, and so forth.
Last but not least.
Good morning, my name is Mark Gull. I'm head of fixed income at Pension Insurance Corporation, or PIC as we like to call ourselves. We're in the bulk purchase annuity space. So we think very long term. Our portfolio is almost entirely fixed income, and we're working very hard to integrate ESG assessments into how we think about the risk management of our portfolio. It's a big focus this year.
It's a bit confusing when it comes to the end of the year. ESG, it's big, it's everywhere. And when I get back to the office, my inbox will be full of press releases, of surveys of anything ESG related, like more insurers are pulling out of their vesting from coal and things like that. And it's headline news, whether that's protecting the environment or greater leadership diversity or taking better care of customer data or human rights in the supply chain. I mean, there was also a growing body of research both from academia and from the financial services industry that points to the fact that those who pursue an ESG strategy, not only will it reduce the level of risk in a portfolio, but it could also, over the long term, generate higher returns. Definitely. So, and when we do discuss at these events ESG, the conversation is largely restricted to equities. I mean, some property does come into it in terms of energy and water efficient buildings, but ESG and fixed income is something we just touch on, and that's part of the problem. We just touch on it because if you consider how important fixed income debt is to institutional portfolios, it should be a bigger part of the ESG debates, and maybe it is becoming so. I mean, it's part of the mainstreaming process at the moment that the ESG is clearly going through. I don't know, but we think maybe it's time that we did more than just scratch the surface here of this debate. So a good place to start with you, Alan. Tell me how some of the companies or some of the schemes you're working with are they actually trying to integrate ESG into their fixed income portfolios?
As a trustee, I need to tap into all wealth creators and those who create wealth or share the products of that wealth in different ways. There'll be an equity slice, there'll be a debt slice, there'll be all sorts of ways in which wealth creators share with wealth consumers such as me. So it's logical that one takes account of all of the ways in which money emerges from wealth creators. I think it's very timely that we switch the emphasis from reliance on the equity output stream to other streams that emerge from the businesses in which we invest. And obviously at the present time, the statistics that companies are relying much more heavily on debt as opposed to equity. So it seems rather strange that we are focusing all the attention on the equity stream, not looking at the debt and fixed income stream. One of my favourite words is integration, because I contrast ethical investment, which I found very difficult to come to terms with, and ESG. I think that ESG is just a modern way of ensuring that wealth creators create more long-term wealth than they destroy. And as a trustee, I want to tap into those who are creating wealth with an ESG philosophy. And I'm very lucky to work with an increasing number of consultants who are embedding ESG in their work. I know people around this table today have introduced themselves as ESG specialists, but I hope that in the long term there won't be an ESG specialist and a non-ESG specialist. ESG should just be what we do.
Mark, how are you embedding ESG into fixed income?
Well, I think just as a background, I've been looking at bonds and bond markets for over 30 years, and it's all about managing risk. As a bond investor, you're professionally miserable because it's about the downside. You can only lose money, hard to make very much money, and it's about getting your money back. And you tie that with the type of institution we are, where we have long-term liabilities going out 50 years plus. What is really crucial to what we do is to manage risk properly. And ESG, I think, is a good way of codifying some of those risks that are the non-financial risks. It's obviously more than that, but good credit investors have always thought about things like governance, have always, if you want to invest long-term, you need to invest in a business that has a sustainable model. Those have always been crucial things. I think the environmental aspect is growing as climate changes is clearly happening, and is clearly happening more quickly. So for us, it's very much about, do we understand the risks in anything we invest in? And ESG is a great way to help us do that and to codify some of those risks. So we're busily integrating ESG into our credit assessments.
Okay, so what do you look for when a new bond or whatever, or a direct loan or whatever comes across your desk? What exactly are you looking for?
Well, you want to get your money back. I mean, that's the first and foremost. But you're looking to understand the risks, and outside of sort of the credit ratings and so forth. Let's take some of the sectors we lend to directly, something like housing associations. I would say we're very confident lending to those over the long term because we believe they provide a very good social purpose. Now, we'll also go and talk to them and say, what are you doing? Making sure in terms of environmental issues, are they not building on the floodplain? Are they using sensible, sustainable materials when they build houses? And then we ask them questions about how they deal with their tenants as well. But fundamentally, we're confident in that sector. There is always going to be a societal need to provide housing, so it's a long-term social good. So that's an example of something we love.
And Scott, what about you in ESG?
So I think to that point, it's that risk asymmetry between debt and equity. Clearly, we are managing that downside risk, and in a bond portfolio, severe negative credit events take a very long time to recover from. But we're just emphasising the point, it isn't just about that risk management point. It is also, I think at work, but also the extent to what extent is ESG priced into credit risk. And I think, looking historically, it's more about whether there's it's more linked to a governance event, whether it's accounting misstatement, bribe and corruption issue, poor management of the business, that's generally led to some a negative credit event. But I think the more that the market is realising just how what I think a lot of fixed income investors should have been doing for a long time is really factoring in the wider ESG. Maybe we'll get to see the market price it in a bit more going forward. But I'd say it's not just about the risk management, it's also using it for opportunities and to really identify those companies. I wouldn't necessarily, you can't just take a best-in-class approach, but it's the ones that are kind of doing well across the whole range of E, S and G factors. But it's about the ones really identifying where, certainly through engagement in fixed income, it's powerful that you can actually really be along for the journey with that company. But or actually sovereign debt, I think, comes into this as well,
Okay.
where there's an important transition. And I think as the market is, and what the ESG is about, I think also being cognizant of the fact there's a wider range of stakeholders here. It's not just about the bondholder as it's the most important stakeholder from this perspective. It's about society, or a whole different range of stakeholders within a company. It's the employees. To what extent some of the factors that the companies and these externalities that might exist that are borne by the way the business behaves, impact on its environment, for example. If these gradually over time become internalized, higher costs, higher taxes, more regulation, what does that do to the sustainability of the business model of that company? And I think that's where it's just continuing. It is an evolving in terms of analysis, if you like. But I think it's just trying to look at also opportunities as well as looking at downside risk.
Okay. And the schemes you're working with, is ESG and fixed income something they're raising more and more? Is it something you're raising?
I think at this point in time, it's something that we're taking to clients as opposed to them proactively raising that. But having had that conversation, and something that you touched on just there, Scott, was the relevance of engagement to fixed income. And that is something which at this point in time, clients are less familiar with the ability to do that in fixed income portfolios. And part of my role is to help them understand that actually that's hugely relevant to fixed income portfolios. And as portfolio managers and analysts, that is something that they have the ability to do and have real weight in doing. If a company wishes to raise further debt capital, that is a huge influence on their ability to do that at attractive prices. So there's, I think, still a bit of an education piece when it comes to client engagement with that concept, but I think that tide is turning.
What about you, Tommy? What are you seeing in the ESG and fixed income with your clients? What kind of schemes you're working with?
Yeah, I would maybe go sort of somewhere that it's not necessarily totally new concept. So I guess there's a bit more history to it, and that risk management that you might brought in, and where governance been always there and really essential. If you wanted to get paid for your emerging market high yield, you need to figure out who owns the bond. But I would take the somewhere towards Alan in a way, that big investment beliefs. As owners, you have big investment beliefs, and if you have investment beliefs in sustainability, if you think of climate change is important, so obviously that needs to go into every part of your portfolio. So there's no way that you can sort of compartmentalize the risk that, okay, now we have climate crisis is happening all in equity. So obviously it's a natural part of that. It needs to go across everything.
Jennifer mentioned then engagement. Engagement is a big part of ESG. We was told about creating change from within. So Mark, how are you engaging with companies? Is it easier with fixed income? You don't vote at AGMs and things like that.
As bondholders, as you say, we don't vote, but I think Jennifer's made the key point that the time you have the maximum influence is when the bond is originated. If you're talking to the borrower, they want your money, so you have leverage at that point. And we're particularly active when we engage because we do quite a lot of direct or bilateral loans, and it is a great time to talk to the potential borrowers and say, look, what are you doing about these things? So, for instance, we've been lending to some universities, and you talk to them about what they're doing for student welfare. Or if it's a piece of student accommodation, and you make sure things like fire standards are done properly, and they've got student safety and welfare at the heart of everything they do. It's harder for kind of listed bonds, particularly if you are a small holding and there's a lot of bonds out there.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should be shy of that. I think we do communicate and we do need to, as an industry, we do need to start asking more questions. And I think we'll find that most of the issuers will be surprisingly responsive. I think they're very aware that this is a factor.
Okay.
Can I ask a question on that, Matt? Because even good companies have a limited amount of time to engage with asset owners. And traditionally, a CEO or chief investment officer has had one visit from the equity specialist to the investment institution, and then the fixed income specialist wants to come along. Is there a degree of integration going on now in the asset management community that you send along the transport specialist to meet the chief executive of a transport company, and we'll discuss equity and debt holistically rather than have two bites of the cherry and risk irking the people that you want to cooperate with.
I'm going to hand this over because we don't do equities and we just do bonds effectively. So
Yeah, so Newton, so effectively we're in a fortunate position where all our equity, global equity and fixed income analysts sit together on the same floor in London. So actually, by the very nature of the way we work together, non-ESG, we work, sometimes we look at the same company, sometimes not, we compare industry notes as well. But multiple occasions I would have been myself as a credit analyst to a related equity meeting, and actually public companies, equity investors get much better access to senior management. In high yield credit investors get good access because against that need to be less avenues to raise capital. But from an ESG perspective, I've already been to numerous meetings with my equity colleagues where we own the bonds as well, and it's actually just a really good way to really kind of push management, not only from how you're looking after different stakeholders from a governance point of view. Are you leveraging up and using debt to do so, or are you paying dividends, or are you actually focused on the balance sheet? That's just obviously financial policy. It's important from a governance point of view, obviously for returns. Actually, a lot of what the environmental, the social factors are absolutely identical, as important for equity holders as they are for holders as well. Equity markets, I think generally investors do have more means through which work together when engaging with companies, and we can see, for example, Climate Action 100 and some of the oil and gas industry. There's some of the work that's been done there and as well. But I think that's very much in its infancy within fixed income, and I hope to see much more collaboration going forward, because ultimately, certainly some of the larger companies, you're generally going to be a much smaller proportion of the total debt holding, and you don't get that vote. But if you can really kind of club together and speak to other asset managers about some of these really important ESG factors, that's the real way to probably affect change. But the way we see engagement really working the best and the most measurable improvements so far is the smaller the company, if it's private, and the weaker the credit rating. And again, it's really the avenues of capital available to them. And we're already a year and a half into a very successful engagement with a UK private food retailer. There are many other means, I think, which fixed income can have quite a powerful impact. And I think it was someone recently linked to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, one of the original CEOs, saying that I think 60% of the high emitters, or fossil fuel emitters globally, are not listed. So actually, the power that fixed income has, but actually I think should take upon itself to really try and get involved and really try to improve standards. So yes, working together is key when you really do have that ability, but not everyone has that. I think more collaboration in market-wide would really be beneficial for all stakeholders.
Mark, you mentioned that your prime directive is, first of all, top of the list is to make money, not to lose money. I think is where you put it. Are investors having to sacrifice return by investing in a sort of an ESG compliant bond? Because we do get specialist bonds like green bonds and things, rather than just the mainstream bonds.
Well, I think the first thing is it's back to sort of fundamental credit analysis. If you get your credit analysis right, and don't forget we think ourselves as very long-term bond holders, because of the nature of our long-term liabilities. Buying the bond with the highest yield on day one may not be the best thing to do, because are you actually going to get that yield? And that's what you're considering, and you're considering it when you integrate ESG into all your credit assessments.
Yeah.
That's part of the distance. Something may be yielding a bit more because there's a bit of uncertainty about the way a risk may be developing. If you think that risk is underpriced, you probably shouldn't be buying that. So in that way, you may be giving up a bit of short-term yield. I mean, let's take bonds in certain industries, the energy industries. We can debate here whether they're starting to price in some ESG risk. If you think there's more of that to come through, there might be higher carbon taxes. Other people might be selling the bonds because of their desire for social impact and those types of things. Yeah, they may be yielding a bit more, but if that trend has got much further to go, you will be giving up a bit of day one return, but long term you get a better return. And for us, it's all about the long term return and making sure that's there. And a lot of these are quite long term factors. You don't quite know the timing of some of them to come out. So if you're managing your risk and thinking about that, you won't necessarily buy the highest yielding bonds, but you'll be buying the bonds that you think have you have the lowest long-term risk, and ESG is part of that. So it's not a straightforward. You're just giving up return. It's about what you think the long-term return will be.
Just if I might chip in on that,
of course.
it's something that many pension schemes have been investing in for some time is buy and maintain credit portfolios. So you made the point about holding for the long term, and clearly if you're holding to maturity, then it is that long-term trajectory that you are most focused on. You don't have the ability to trade out. If a risk crystallizes in the short term, you can't do that unless you breach covenant.
Yeah, and as an insurance company, we are under what is called a buy-to-hold structure. If we use the matching adjustment, which we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that, I suppose the buy and hold, so we use a risk developing, I suppose, in the short end, if there might be some sort of good relative value elements there that, okay, you go into something that you wouldn't go in the longer term. And what we see that buy and hold and maintain is also the space where, as it managers at the moment, we rate managers' strategies and where we see the best ESG integration. So about 30% of those strategies at the moment come into the sort of two highest categories. So obviously it is very important in that space.
Is it easier to assess a green bond, for instance, rather than a sort of mainstream bond? Is that because I know that green bonds there's a lot of criticism attached to them. So if someone gives you a green bond, is it an easier assessment in terms of its credentials?
I can start by answering this. So I look at quite a few green bonds. The first point I say is it comes down to fundamental bottom-up credit analysis. Many companies I've seen call themselves, issue a green bond, but it's the credit risk we don't want. We saw a couple of years ago, German listed wind turbine assembler, Sembian, launched a green bond. 2 years later, it's defaulted. So just because it's green, you can't buy it and then forget about it. And also, it's really very important there's a second party opinion, alignment of that green bond to the green bond principles, the climate bonds initiative, for example. So it's about the use of proceeds, in terms of being appropriate. And then I think the buyer of those green bonds has to also look at its own philosophy and process. Yeah. Do you associate with those use of proceeds just because they meet green bond principles, for example? And some of these bonds get graded in shades of green by different verifiers. So there is not that much consistency. It's improving through taxonomy and the EU taxonomy, trying to improve standardization here. And I think it's a really powerful way to try and mobilize mainstream capital, which I think is critical. And I think fixed income has a big part to play within that. I think it just has to be done. Eventually, come back down to your bottom-up credit analysis. Does the risk reward make sense? And if it's green, then actually that's an added benefit. All different flavors of bonds, SDG-linked bonds, transition bonds. I think actually, if the market, which I believe in, if you want to mobilize mainstream capital, you have to be able to look at issuers. It's not just specific green projects. You've got to try and really reduce those emissions. And actually, some of those transition stories can really make sense. But it comes down to proper reporting, tracking, robust targets of those issuers themselves.
This is an area, Matt, where I rely very heavily on my investment consultant to make sure that what I'm buying hasn't just been given a label by the marketing department who says that this will sell, so let's call it this. Really have to look at the underlying assets that we are putting people's money in. And I think those who are responsible investors with the capital need to make sure that the whole concept isn't devalued by rogues in the marketing department who say, call it green and it will sell. It's not in my interest, but I don't think it's in the asset manager's long-term interest either.
I heard from one of the leads of European Syndicate, one of the large investment banks last week, saying the order books for green bonds versus non-green are 20% larger. But we're not mandated in any way to accept a low return just because it's green. Generally speaking, pricing is comparable to non-green bonds, but that's something we're aware of. Maybe in a risk-off scenario, the spreads hold in better than non-green because there are less sellers, there's more sticky holders, but we will not be buying anything that's priced more expensively just because it's green.
Putting in the overall portfolio perspective from asset owners aside as well, sort of it's clearly may not be the sort of the core type of fixed income. So it may be a satellite for a specific reason there. Because like if you look at the universe, what is it there? There's about 1 trillion out there at the moment. So it's relatively concentrated, and you get certain sectors in quite heavily. And then you should be sort of reflecting that against the rest of it. And obviously like climate change, for example, happens at the sector level. So you need to start to understand sectors better and where you take the risk in as an asset owner. So that's really important. So not just to look at the bond itself, but how does it fit into the overall strategic asset allocation and so on.
Yeah. Gotcha, yeah. I mean, I myself have heard horror stories about people who've gone to looking at new bonds with green in the title, and they can't really work out what's so green about it. I mean, new standards are coming in from regulators around what is a green bond and what issuers have to do. I mean, is this new regulation, are these new standards, are they helping? Are they making the job easier? Are they giving you more confidence? Or are you still relying on your credit analysts?
I mean, you've got to rely on your credit analysts. Is the bottom line. I concur with what Scott has said. We don't buy anything because it is green. And again, we're not mandated to accept a lower yield for that. And so we just think about back to the core fundamentals, and we're going to get our money back. Clearly, if they're in sectors and doing the right sort of things, that's fine. But it's more about what the overall borrower is doing rather than specifically that stream of money, unless it's project finance.
With I suppose the EU taxonomy is obviously always out there, and obviously one interesting point, bigger picture, is it's only focused on the E, and obviously there's a lot of other things going on as well. But the other thing is actually, when I talked about some of this, transition, and really trying to maybe mobilise, enable some of these really high emitters or try and encourage them to lower emissions. I think some of the early thresholds within the taxonomy might be quite restrictive. So I think it's not quite set yet, I believe, in terms of what would be allowable in terms of from a green bond perspective. It might not allow a company that actually is on a really good trajectory, but currently its threshold of emissions is too high to fit into that camp. So I do see, given the different flavours of bonds in this area that are being launched all the time, I think investors are open to kind of listening to the different stories. It's quite hard to measure or get consistency in the data as well. But we absolutely need standardisation. Obviously, what the EU is doing, the European Commission is going the right way. But I think it shouldn't be too restrictive, because there are only a certain pool of specifically eligible green projects out there. And the market needs larger liquid bond issue sizes. It can't be a 50 million project with no liquidity from a main daily price funds in terms of being involved there as well. So, and obviously the rating agencies are in on the movement as well, which actually is helping. But it feels like we're still quite early. I don't know what people.
Across my whole spectrum of trusteeship, I find prescription a hindrance rather than a help. Prescription can stultify the world. People end up getting very definitionally focused and think, am I complying with this particular definition? That definition might have been designed 5 or 10 years ago. I'm much more interested in having clear principles and then allowing professionals to apply those principles where it makes sense, rather than keep looking back to see, am I complying with this prescription or that prescription. Becomes very legalistic and counterproductive.
I think a lot of the conversations around here is about getting the right investments and making sure we're doing the right things about that. And some of the issues that we face around ESG is it's very complex, it's very nuanced, and there's a huge degree of uncertainty about what is going to happen out there. So measuring some of these things is really, really hard. So I mean, I think that point, going back to sensible principles rather than legalistic definitions, is a very good approach.
But someone maybe needs to give a little bit of a push on the standards and regulation as well, because it is very useful signalling effect. And for example, in conversations with asset owners, if there is something out there, like EU at the moment says that you need to be 30% below in terms of your carbon intensity, that's a kind of starting point to be on a 2-degree pathway. So it gives some sort of signalling effect, and it's good. And all around the table, we're just applying our own processes and philosophies on these things, and then we come up with the best investment, like you said, Mark.
You mentioned there, Scott, about green bonds largely about the E, but when you look at ESG and like a mainstream bond coming through, what are the things that people look for your clients? What are they looking for? Is anything to do with welfare or looking at the supply chain? What sort of questions are they asking you guys about?
Governance is huge. Governance is the foundation of the majority of questions. I think the environmental aspect has gained a lot more attention in the more recent past because of the global focus on what's happening climate-wise and what needs to happen to address that. But going back to fundamental credit analysis, governance is a huge part of that, the ability of management to execute a strategy and the ability to do that over the long term. If you have a board that is not sufficiently equipped or skilled to do that, or if there are inadequate control mechanisms in place, then that will pose a threat to the ability of a company to do that. So the governance foundation pillar is absolutely crucial.
And that's always been the case. And years gone by, we have turned down investments because we don't like the governance. We don't think management's got a handle on things. We don't think they've got the right people there. And that hasn't changed. And I don't think that will ever change. Actually, in fixed income investing, it's always been a core determinant of whether you're prepared to lend somebody some money for a long period of time.
I think different genre of asset owners will have different priorities. Endowments, high net worth individuals might have a different perspective. From a trustee perspective, the G is the most important one because trustees are very focused on making sure that they govern their schemes well, and it's natural therefore for them to look to make sure that businesses in which we invest are equally well governed, and if they are well governed, then the E and the S will be taken care of as well. So I'll make no apology for focusing more on the G than the E and the S.
And this is from a risk, fixed income, from a risk perspective as well. Governance failures, working conditions failures linked to obviously the social side. These things can ultimately all really impact a company's license to operate and its reputation. Yeah. And if that fails, then the business fails. Yeah. So it kind of is inherent in terms of credit analysis, risk assessment anyway, but it's just being putting that out into something which is called ESG and being a bit more specific about it. And I suppose ensuring that effectively is raised in terms of companies are becoming more accountable and to answer these questions more eloquently and robustly than they have in the past.
It might be re-engineering governance, but for example, I guess you need to start to ask the governance how well it understands, for example, climate change. That becomes part of governance then. So CDP numbers came out yesterday. There were 200 companies, still big global companies, some in high-risk sectors that had no idea of transition. So are they well governed?
Yeah.
I would sort of challenge that.
Governance is quite big, of course, because scandal usually sort of comes from the governance side of things. You look at big tech at the moment, how they're misusing data. That's obviously a good governance issue. What about you, Ashton? If you on the bond side of things, rather than the equity side of things, if things aren't living up to expectations, or obviously we discussed about the return. Is
actually we've looked at things like bribery scandals and things like that. And we've sold out of BAE with issues going on in Saudi Arabia and getting concerned about how they are running that. So yes, that's an example of something we have done in the past, and that was probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, before there was this big. ESG was around, but there wasn't this focus that there wasn't on ESG at the time. But it was concerns about governance and not managing that properly.
And I think perhaps that comes back to the fact that this isn't actually new.
No, it's not. It's a way of codifying. Exactly.
And for good credit analysts and for good bond managers, they've been looking at this for an awfully long time. I think it's clearly got more attention now, but it has been a part of that analysis.
And as you said at the beginning, our stakeholders now are asking us to demonstrate that we're doing this, and I think that's what's really changed. I think.
Shall we expect that there's something that the good bond analysts didn't look at 10 years ago?
Oh yeah, I think there were less. No, I think that's absolutely right. Well, there's something, because the world is always changing, and you're always making a risk assessment at a point in time, and you buy something, and expect it to pay you back in, let's say, 30 years' time. You're always updating your view, looking at it, checking it, because the environment always changes. And I think clearly the biggest factor that has changed over the last few years is the realisation that climate change is happening, and it's happening fast.
Mark, you asked me if I'd sort of been disappointed. I'm not as close to the individual holdings as other people around the table, since I'm buying more often than not a packaged product. One of the areas where I think trustees need to be careful is when one uses terms like buy and hold, buy and maintain. We make an investment in a bond expecting that bond to be almost like a gilt with attitude, or produce an income over the next 10, 15, 20 years. If for whatever reason something is re-rated and it shoots the lights out within the next 5 or 10 years, then I may well not want to buy and hold, and particularly at a time when we are transferring risk from the pensions regime to the insurance regime. I do need to be fleet-footed, so liquidity is important to me, and the changing characteristics of a packaged investment. If I've made all the profit I'm going to make in a third of the term I was expecting to make it, then I'll bank it. Thank you.
I'll just add to Toy's point as well. What is changing in terms of the way, I think, did analysts look at this 10 years ago or not? But I think the responses that we expect from issuers has changed. Yeah. So in the past, maybe 10 years ago, you get a vaguely satisfactory response about the governance structure or the way they're thinking about environmental hazards. But maybe that's sufficient, and we'll buy your bonds anyway. Whereas now, I think there's really much more scrutiny on the quality of the answers you're getting when it comes to the ESG detail. I know from our perspective in some of the meetings I'm in, and I think the market is beginning to really distinguish between those issuers that are well prepared and answering questions on ESG strategy quite well and offering insight, and those that are not.
And I think that's quite an interesting point to link to bond managers as well. I mean, as I'm sure you do as well, Tommy, we rate managers and strategies on how well they articulate their integration of ESG factors. We have come across a couple of managers predominantly located in the US who have not been able to articulate that at all, and have been a little bit surprised that the question has been raised. So, it's certainly not just been us raising that question. It has been, across the European sort of, consultancy asset owner community that they've begun to have that placed on their agenda. But there is a moving feast when it comes to the ability of a manager to articulate that as well as at company level.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing. I mean, we also employ external managers as well as managing money internally ourselves with external bond managers. And we have had the ones we do employ. We think they are taking ESG seriously, but they are doing it differently, and there are definitely different levels of skills out there. And there are some managers that have really focused on this for a very long time and thought about it, and I think are probably slightly ahead of other managers in some of their understanding and particularly articulation of the risks and the way to use it to construct portfolios intelligently.
Yeah.
Maybe there's sort of like a good spot to put a bit of figures behind it. So the ratings, we've done it for 10 years and now. So what we've seen, for example, in the past 5 years, the best ratings, 1s and 2s, so people who would think opportunities and risks, basically. So they've increased from 5% to 10. You say, oh, great, it's doubled. But there's 90% out there actually who's not really working well with the both aspects of risk and opportunities. So yes, that's happening in fixed income. In equities, sort of numbers are from like 10% to 20%. So fixed income has come a little bit behind, but still there's a fair few managers out there who aren't thinking through this, or maybe have this sort of a bit of an oversight and gloss type of ESG processes. And from as an owner's perspective, obviously it's extremely important to sort of have the eyeball factor and understand that, okay, so is there a good process? Is there a good team here behind?
There's a lot of what we've heard in the past 5 minutes. Does that go back to the education point that was raised with the asset managers issues with the questions and the answers already? I mean, is the education part being led by you guys on the advisory side?
I think so. I mean, it's increasingly something that having gone through that training, education piece, beliefs discovery, determining a framework for how that individual client wants to take this forward and what they want to do and how they can do that practically. then when they see managers, that is something that we will help prepare them to ask about. What information do they need? And I think something that often can come out is that often when you ask for information, you get a lot of it, but it's not necessarily decision useful. So what is the quality of information that you need, and distilling that down into a usable format is critical for a client that has many other things to consider as well.
I think from a trustee perspective, some advanced wake-up training is important, so that then we can have just-in-time training when these asset classes become really, really relevant, and we can make decisions much more quickly in the light of that just-in-time training, having had some generic wake-up training, perhaps on an annual training day when you're doing blue sky thinking rather than make your mind up time thinking.
Sovereign debt, usually high grade, highly liquid, probably the mainstay of many fixed income portfolios. Are you guys investing in government debt? I mean, if you've got, if someone's got an ESG sort of, if they factor ESG into their thinking and looking at a government bond, I mean, assessing a government on its ESG can be quite large and got fingers in a lot of pies, to say. So how do you assess government debt on the side?
That's work in progress for us. So freely admit that it's a harder thing to do. The other thing is, if you're managing a corporate bond portfolio, if you're managing a sterling corporate bond portfolio, let's take that as an example.
Yes,
it's very hard to manage that effectively without having the ability to go into gilts, maintain your duration, and then come out against if you happen to have a very negative view on the US government. Clearly, if you're looking at emerging markets and so forth, a lot of the things is focusing on corruption and the governance and how those aspects work. We don't do that in-house. That's our source, and we're confident that our manager looks at that pretty closely.
I think integration when it comes to sovereign debt has been focused, as you say, on emerging markets. But if we take, for example, Australia, and I know that's slightly low-hanging fruit given the wildfires at the moment, but you have an economy which is heavily reliant on use of natural resources. You have an economy which is very susceptible and is seeing the outcome of climate change and what that means for the ability of the government to continue to raise revenue and continue to fulfil its social programs. That's a developed market, clearly, where it is certainly possible to examine the physical and transition-related risks that apply to that economy as a sovereign entity. So I completely agree with you that EM has been, in many ways, the focus of sovereign debt integration, but it's highly applicable to DM as well.
I think for us, first of all, we've always been doing this for quite some time, but we look at data sets, publicly available data sets, as World Bank, other Transparency International corruption indices. So we construct our own. We score each country or a proprietary score, but it's data we always looked at, and we try to choose data sets which are public, which there's a 1 to 2 year lag often, but at least we can kind of see some trends in terms of this thing improving and the change being made, and then we overlay our proprietary, so our sovereign specialists on that. And I think obviously that the ESG is obviously many different factors within this, but is capital allocation from kind of developed countries are much more able and have the capital and to allocate it to effectively the environment and try whether it's flood defences, trying to improve the energy mix, whereas more emerging some of the really less endowed emerging markets are going to find it might be a debate between emissions and how well you can feed your people. So there's a lot of different factors to consider. Foreign investors, can you engage with the sovereigns? Obviously, it's much harder. The electorate is the most important stakeholder to them, but there are many ways through which there's obviously NGO links, but there's also other government members, different parts of the government that you can actually have the opportunity to meet, and at least depending on the size of the country, again, and how much they're relying on the external capital can influence the debate as well in terms of policies. but it's not always as easy, clearly, to affect change. And I suppose emerging markets, the ones that are less diversified, and maybe where they have a weaker tax base, it's really even more important. It's a social construct and human rights within that, in terms of really being able to have the buy-in of the people in terms of actually maintaining that stability. So it's a really interesting area, and I think effectively we score countries, and for our sustainable portfolios, we have effectively a list of countries we will not invest in, and there are some which are on watch, and when extra pieces of work needed to be done, our responsible investment team has a veto on that in terms of whether they're in or out, and we look at trends. And obviously, developed markets, you look at the US, it actually scores quite well in lots of different areas. However, look at what's happened post-Paris, whether it's factors within human rights, but then there's obviously the state versus federal levels, so it's quite an interesting debate in itself. But I think it's as important for sovereign debt and some of these big issues, certainly on the environment and social side, that have really material shifts on success or not of a country and its prosperity. So I think it's something which again we've considered it, but it's being brought a bit more into more specifics. It's certainly on the environment, and people beginning to compare different governments' policies on the environment.
Can I comment on sovereign debt and the flip side, which is sovereign wealth, which is often the wealth of the sovereign rather than sovereign wealth? And I do get quite twitchy as a trustee when I'm co-investing with people who have quite different objectives to me, not necessarily different moral standards, but different objectives. And I think it can be quite challenging for a trustee to be involved with people who are so different, so diverse, and might have different expectations from their investment than I have. My main aim is to make sure that whether it's defined benefit or defined contribution, produce a regular income stream for older people who have no longer got the energy to work. And I think we do need to make sure that our co-investees are the sort of co-investees that we are happy with having them as co-investees. I think there is a lot more work to be done on the alignment of objectives of different stakeholders.
I'm going to touch on something that you mentioned about the state and federal level and looking at sub-sovereign debt, muni bonds, for example. And if we look at what's happening in some of the municipalities around the eastern seaboard of the US and pricing in flood risk, for example, that is a material ESG related risk, which is affecting that entity's ability to raise debt capital and to provide flood defence. So that sort of sub-sovereign level is important too.
And obviously links to green bonds in terms of some European countries obviously on the green bandwagon as well.
Yes.
Does fiscal policy happen in Germany, and is it linked to green bonds, green gilts people are calling for?
That's a very good point actually, because some countries say that France, for example, have issued specific green bonds for the state to invest in green projects, and the UK government has set sort of targets on carbon neutrality or net carbon neutrality and things like that. So do you think we're far off a UK sovereign green bond?
It doesn't make sense to me that they haven't gone further down that road yet, given their approach to climate change. So I'm not quite sure of the reason why.
Well, they've got other things in their mind at the moment.
Maybe a few things.
Yeah. Gotcha. But would a sovereign green bond issued by the British government, would that make things easier in terms of adding into an ESG compliant portfolio, do you think? If the funds were being used specifically for certain projects?
I think the signalling effect of that is very important. The economy signals something, the government signals, whichever government does this, the signalling effect is very important. So then you guys know the pricing of that bond better, but I think that's
I agree with the signalling, outside the portfolio construction points, the signalling effect is important, and it's and it would be welcome that these things have been taken more seriously, and there are certain things they want to be measured on. Would we buy it just because it's a green bond? No, we don't have a mandate to do that. We would consider again. We go back to considering the fundamental risk, and does it work for the portfolio? Does it produce the right income to pay our pensioners? And those key things. but it's a separate thing to me outside portfolio management. That, but very welcome nonetheless.
As long as it's not greenwashing, it is that signalling and that message you're giving to commerce and industry in terms of, right, this is the direction, right, we're moving in, you should be moving in as well. And maybe further regulations will be following.
Governments have a track record of saying that pension funds have got all this money that they don't need for the time being. We as government can make a lot better use of it than you can, so can you please lend it to us or do things that we command you to do? I'm not comfortable with governments just viewing my pension fund assets as a tool for them to use.
And I'm moving away from that green bond.
Yeah.
So, okay, ESG credit ratings. So there's an initiative listed by a PRI that was launched some 5 years ago, and obviously it's taken quite a lot of sort of credit rating agencies have come behind it. Some of the agencies have, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 times the people, i.e. from 1 to 40 in the past 4 years. So if you think of that, I guess they are well placed to think governments. And governments, I guess they have a good track record. They may not have that good track record elsewhere, but with governments, they have a relatively good track record of understanding. So, and obviously they also come from that sort of bottom-up analysis first. Corporates are easy. Governments are sort of top-down, more macro, more difficult, but they're working that way. And I guess in ESG, there's sort of country ceilings on any credit ratings for corporates, or maybe it starts to work on ESG the same way.
And one factor where we will score a country better than another is it's about having a longer term perspective, because obviously governments change, whether it's developed markets, emerging markets. But if there's this construct where they can invest not through a cycle, but through different government cycles, then that's actually what you need. A lot of this is very long term in nature. The infrastructure, the spend, it takes a long time just to get the equipment and the cement together to be able to then allocate and properly allocate to projects. And so it is, it's a very long-term horizon that's required, I think, from within this ESG focus within governments, and they need to be able to think past short-termist perspectives.
Well, green bonds do seem to be quite well established at the moment. There's a record number being issued in that particular market, but we've also got blue bonds, social bonds, transition bonds. There's been an ED, Stable Development Goal linked bond. I mean, are these sort of sub-offshoots, are they fads, or are they here to stay, or will they be gobbled up by the mainstream? I mean, what do you think about all these different bonds coming in?
It's not easy for consistency's sake. I think ultimately how an issuer decides to come to the market, it can be the investment banks trying to persuade an issuer to issue a certain bond because the market's there and they're trying to get their own name raised in that specific segment. Or it can be the issuer has a fundamental reason to issue that green debt, green bonds. But just because an issuer, for us, issues green bonds doesn't mean that we can never look at their non-green bonds, because it's about a holistic perspective. Is the issuer as a whole being responsible in its approach? And then obviously, we talked about already the credit risk underlying that. But I think we'll continue to see more variance. As I mentioned before, if we are really talking about transition, it can't all be in the best green projects that exist today or about to be built, the wind farms. It has to be actually some grayer assets, not necessarily brown, but just in terms of the middle. Can you ultimately, for example, would you lend to a company to invest in a gas project for 20 years when they're trying to wean themselves off coal? So how do you feel about funding gas for a 20-year project? So it comes down to your own philosophy as well. But I think we will see more of these SDG-linked bonds that NL was the first to do. The difference is that the proceeds are general corporate purposes. They're not specific projects. So effectively, you're lending to NL because they say, well, by so-and-so date, our emissions target we will have met, otherwise there'll be a coupon step. I'm all for seeing more covenants in bonds, which you certainly don't get an investment grade, so coupon steps, if there's a penalty if the company does not meet certain targets. But how do you feel about issuing to a company that can do whatever they want with the money? That money could go into a project that you're not quite as keen that it happens. So, but as I know, so mobilising mainstream capital I think is really important, and you have to have a wider perspective. As long as it's done properly, robust, but the measurement and the data quality which is really what you need to be able to track these. And obviously there's the annual certification reporting that these issuers will need to go through, is important and useful, but we've all got to accept that this is in its infancy, and I suppose have some faith that actually companies and issuers will do it properly. But yes, there will continue to be a variety of different types of ESG linked bonds for the market to get its head around.
I guess I would want to pick up on when you say is it a fashion or fad. Hence it comes back to this initial beliefs, investment beliefs and understanding sustainability. If sustainability is a fashion, then you could say that it's a fashion. I don't think so. I think sustainability is an imperative that asset owners and everybody in the finance industry has to somehow express and implement. So hence anything that is, whether it's green or blue or whatever, is part of that. And then you just use those tools to properly calibrate that into your portfolio. It may not be core, maybe a satellite for someone that has a purpose today for something in that portfolio, in that overall journey to express that sustainable investment belief.
And within mainstream fixed income, the more you go off track, an issuer does, and issues a certain type of bond, a blue bond, for example, then for us, it's all about liquidity is the most important thing for our bond funds.
Yeah.
So we will not go anywhere if the issue size is too small, if it's too off the run. It's the risk reward does not make sense for us. So I think that will probably help keep markets, or the types of bonds that are issued, relatively mainstream. Because if you go too far off, I think you go more maybe into project risk or capital, where maybe there won't be 3 credit rating agencies rating that bond. And effectively, that's I think that will be an important driver as well.
Good, yeah. Just the blue bond we're talking about, that was issued for Pacific water projects due to the sea, which is still an environmental issue. So my point of view is one actually a green bond. So I just that's the way I see it. But we're coming to the out mark now. So just final question. I mean, 2020 is coming up. We've already discussed talks in the EU about taxonomy and setting new standards and new governments, and there was a political will to halt environmental damage and make the world greener. So is this all good news for people with specific fixed income mandates next year, when things are getting a lot easier when it comes to talking to companies and finding opportunities to invest?
I think you're right to say this is becoming part of the normal conversations we have now in fixed income when we're looking at these things, and that is very, very welcome. But in terms of getting data that everybody understands, consistency, standards, that's really difficult because we're trying to look into the future, and that's never easy. Yeah. But as a bond fund manager, taking a position, taking a view, making an investment, that's part of what you have to do as a judgment. And I think it's important that we remember when we try and measure all these things, the limitations of some of these measurements, because if you try and overdo it, overdo some of these audits and processing, you end up with things done to suit a process to tick a box, rather than focusing on the key long-term fundamental issues, which is about making good, for us, particularly making the good credit decisions. But it's clearly here, the ESG conversations are here. They're going to continue to grow. I think all sensible fund managers are going to have a clearly articulated process and philosophy about how they think about it, and it, I think that's got to be good news, because it's increasing awareness for some of these long-term risks.
Gotcha.
Okay. I would just add, actually, I think it's really interesting. It throws up a whole range of opportunities. I think it's really interesting, and what we're saying. But I think also there are more and more expectations on the managers themselves in terms of to talk about how they're doing it and what they're doing. So for us, I think it's really about what we're trying to be as transparent as possible. And the companies we engage with, we disclose quarterly. But I think it comes back to that transparency in reporting. And obviously that data quality and data measurement is hard within that context.
Very hard, yeah.
I think I suppose clients need to be aware that it is we're trying to encourage all the way through to the issuer to disclose as much useful and consistent data as possible. I think that is where we're moving to now. It's about reporting and transparency and disclosure all the way through to the end client.
Yeah, because companies are disclosing more and more. It's almost becoming standard, whether it's new jobs created or what have you. But you do get these independent data providers. I mean, how credible is some of them? Obviously, you guys have got your own credit analysis, but When it comes to this independent data released, I mean, how credible is it? I mean, is the quality good?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the correlations of, you put an ESG rating and you go out to the three big providers, you look at the correlations between, issuers that get good ratings, they're very low. And that tells you that the ability, to be consistent and pick up consistent data points is not easy in this space. It doesn't mean they don't have some useful information encapsulated within them, and we use them as a way of saying, look, this is where we need to screen and do a bit more work, and they've picked up this area and it looks, they're highlighting a certain risk here. It means we might have to do some more work. It doesn't mean we slavishly believe them, because we can go out and get another rating that might tell us something different. I mean, it's they're not like, say, credit ratings, which are much, much more closely bunched together.
I know, two quick things on that. First of all, when we were looking at procurement, the rating service that we helps our process. It's just one input. We've seen an example of an ESG rating where literally it was a copy and paste. It was on the banking sector, and the wrong bank name was on the top of the report. So you've got to really obviously consider what you're looking at. And secondly, some of this data, though, some of the providers who actually do score from an ESG perspective a wide range of global issuers. In totality, it's quite useful to kind of mine some of that data, and I've looked at some of that. So if I take, for example, European high yield market 2018 standalone, I've looked at 2019 to date. You can see where there's been, every single issue, you can see where there's been the most negative credit return. What is the ESG score of that issuer been? And I don't think it's a coincidence that actually it has tended to be the weaker scoring ESG issuers have been the worst performers, where there's been specific significant blow up. So it does pay, and so it shows you it's not priced into credit spreads because of the return that's happened because of that event. So it shows it does pay to consider it, but some of the data you get from some of these providers can help you in terms of assessing some of these trends, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's about how you interpret that data.
Yeah.
You're not using it as you're using it as somewhere to signal to do further research.
As well.
I think my last word would be alignment. I think it's wonderful that we're having this quality debate about trying to match the needs of the users of capital with the providers of capital. I think it's inherent, it's important that we make sure that this quality of debate isn't undermined by get-rich-quick charlatans who will abuse the spin in order to make money, and in so doing destroy the things that we're discussing. And in the pensions world, I think we have to realise that the tools that we're using in the defined benefit space, where the shareholders are the sponsoring company, the beneficiaries of what we do, to use it in the defined contribution space, where it is the individual consumer who benefits or loses from the way that we deploy our assets. And I think there is hope that as we see consolidation of both defined benefit schemes, whether that's in the pension space or the insurance space, and the consolidation of DC pension schemes into master trusts, we are getting the scale now that allows us to do things that we couldn't do when most pension schemes were subscale. Scale isn't everything in every walk of life, but I think in the areas that we've been discussing today, scale is an asset rather than a liability.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think that's a good place to bring this meeting to a close. For more information on this podcast and any others like it, please visit portfolio-institutional.co.uk. Thank you.